The Montana sky stretched endlessly above the riverside ranch, painted in shades of amber and crimson as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Dust particles danced in the golden light, stirred up by the restless hooves of horses in the nearby corrals. The air carried the scent of dried grass, leather, and sweat, familiar perfumes to anyone who'd spent their life working the land. Henry Morrison stood with his arms crossed, his weathered face creased with frustration as he watched the empty round pen. At 63, he'd seen just about everything a ranch could throw at him, but nothing quite like this. Behind him, a group of ranch hands gathered in hushed conversation, their voices tinged with a mixture of respect and fear. "That devil nearly took my shoulder clean off," muttered William Crawford, the ranch's best horse trainer, rubbing his bandaged arm. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something darker, wounded pride mixed with genuine concern. 27 years I've been breaking horses, Henry. Never seen anything like him." The horse in question stood at the far end of the adjacent pasture, a magnificent black stallion whose coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the fading light. He was powerful, standing at least 16 hands high, with a muscled chest and legs that spoke of both speed and strength. But it was his eyes that told the real story, wild, untrusting, filled with a fire that seemed to burn brighter every time someone approached. They called him Storm, though he'd arrived at the ranch without a name 3 weeks ago. A wild Mustang captured from the mountain ranges during a Bureau of Land Management roundup. Most wild horses adapted eventually, learned to trust, learned to accept human presence. Not Storm. He'd injured 2 experienced handlers, destroyed 3 sections of fencing, and made it abundantly clear that he had no intention of being tamed. "Maybe we should just release him back," suggested Samuel Torres, a younger ranch hand who'd been with Morrison for only 2 years. "Some horses aren't meant to be broken." Henry shook his head slowly. "It's not about breaking him, Sam. Never has been. That horse has potential. You can see it in every movement. But if he can't learn to trust, he's got no future. The BLM will put him down as dangerous. I've seen it happen too many times." The words hung heavy in the cooling evening air. Everyone knew Henry was right. Wild horses that couldn't be gentled, that posed a danger to handlers, rarely got second chances. Charlotte Morrison, Henry's daughter, approached from the main house carrying a thermos of coffee. At 31, she'd grown up on this ranch and could ride as well as any of the men. She'd also inherited her father's stubborn determination and soft heart for troubled animals. "Still talking about Storm?" she asked, pouring coffee into worn mugs. "Dad, maybe it's time to admit we're out of our depth here." "Your father doesn't know the meaning of those words," William said with a weak smile, accepting the coffee gratefully. As if sensing he was being discussed, Storm raised his head and let out a sharp whinny that echoed across the ranch. He pawed at the ground, tossing his magnificent head, his black mane flowing like liquid shadow. Even from a distance, his agitation was palpable. "He's been like that all day," Charlotte observed, "restless, almost like he's looking for something." "Looking for his freedom," Samuel said quietly. "Can't say I blame him." The group stood in contemplative silence, watching the stallion move along the fence line with nervous energy. The truth was settling over them, like the approaching night. They were running out of options, and Storm was running out of time. What none of them noticed was the figure watching from behind the barn, a 17-year-old boy with sandy brown hair and observant hazel eyes. James Turner had been working at Riverside Ranch for only 6 weeks, hired on as general help, mucking stalls, mending fences, hauling feed. He was quiet, kept mostly to himself, and most of the other hands barely acknowledged his presence. But James had been watching Storm since the stallion's arrival. Every morning before dawn, and every evening after the work was done, he'd find himself drawn to the pasture, studying the horse's movements, his behavior, his patterns. There was something in Storm's eyes that James recognized, a deep-seated wariness, a fear masquerading as aggression, a spirit that had been hurt and learned that trust meant pain. James understood that feeling better than most. The morning sun broke over the mountains, casting long shadows across the ranch as James finished mucking out the last stall in the main barn. His hands were calloused, his clothes were dirty, and his back ached. But he'd learned long ago that hard work was a kind of meditation, a way to quiet the thoughts that sometimes threatened to overwhelm him. He'd been in foster care for most of his life, bouncing between homes that ranged from neglectful to adequate, never quite finding a place where he belonged. The Riverside Ranch was his latest stop, a work placement program through his group home. In 3 months, he'd age out of the system completely. The thought terrified and liberated him in equal measure. "Turner," Samuel's voice echoed through the barn. "When you're done there, Henry wants the north pasture fence checked. Storm broke through another section last night." James nodded, grabbing his tools and heading out. The walk to the north pasture took him past Storm's current enclosure, and he found himself slowing, drawn once again to observe the stallion. Storm stood in the center of the space, his coat shimmering in the morning light. But today, something was different. As James approached the fence, the horse's ears swiveled toward him. Instead of the usual aggressive display, the snorting, the charging, the bared teeth, Storm simply stood, watching. James moved slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He'd read everything he could find about wild horses in the ranch's small library, staying up late with a flashlight when the other hands had gone to sleep. He'd learned about their social structures, their communication, their instincts, but more than that, he'd learned to watch, to listen, to feel what the horse might be feeling. "Hey there, Storm," James said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't move closer, just stood at a respectful distance. "Tough morning?" "Yeah, I get those too." The stallion's ears flicked forward, a sign of curiosity. His dark eyes, which had regarded every other human with suspicion and anger, now held something different as they fixed on James. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the tiniest crack in his armor. "You know what I think?" James continued, speaking in that same low, gentle tone. "I think you're not mean. I think you're scared. And when you're scared, you fight. Makes sense to me. I've done the same thing plenty of times." Storm took a single step forward, just one, but it was more than he'd voluntarily offered anyone else. "James!" Charlotte's voice made both boy and horse startle. She approached quickly, concern etched on her face. "What are you doing? That horse is dangerous." "He's just scared," James said, not taking his eyes off Storm. Charlotte stopped a few feet back, her expression softening as she observed the scene. There was something different in the air, something she couldn't quite name. The stallion, who'd been nothing but hostile since his arrival, stood calmly, his attention focused entirely on this quiet teenage boy. "How long have you been coming out here?" she asked gently. "Every day," James admitted. "Morning and evening mostly. I just... I wanted to understand him. Charlotte studied James for a long moment. She'd barely interacted with the boy since he'd arrived. He'd seemed so withdrawn, so determined to remain invisible. But now, seeing him with Storm, she recognized something, a connection, an understanding that went deeper than training or technique. "My father's meeting with the BLM representative tomorrow," she said quietly. "If we can't show progress, they're going to take Storm, and we both know what that means." James's jaw tightened. "Can I try?" "Try what?" "Working with him. I know I'm just the kid who shovels manure, but I think I might be able to help." Charlotte wanted to say no. It was too dangerous. James was too inexperienced. But something stopped her. Maybe the way Storm was still watching the boy, or maybe the desperate hope in James's eyes that mirrored her own feelings about the stallion's fate. "Let me talk to my father," she finally said. Henry Morrison's office was cluttered with decades of ranch records, framed photographs of prize horses, and the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent working with animals. He sat behind his desk, his reading glasses perched on his nose, as Charlotte made her case. "Dad, I know it sounds crazy, but there's something there. The way Storm responded to James—" "The boy has no experience," Henry interrupted, though not unkindly. "Charlotte, I appreciate his interest, but we can't risk—" "Risk what?" Charlotte challenged. "We're out of options. William won't go near Storm again, and I don't blame him. The BLM rep comes tomorrow. What exactly do we have to lose by letting James try?" Henry removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. His daughter was right, though he hated to admit it. "If James gets hurt, then it's on me. I'll supervise every session. But Dad, I watched them this morning. Storm actually moved toward James. Voluntarily. When has he done that with anyone?" After a long moment, Henry nodded slowly. 3 days. That's what I can give you before the BLM makes their decision. But Charlotte, I mean it. Safety first. If that horse shows any sign of aggression—" "I understand." When Charlotte told James that evening, the boy's face transformed. It was the first time she'd seen him truly smile, and it struck her how young he really was. 17, but he carried himself with the weariness of someone much older. "Thank you," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." "You need to understand the stakes," Charlotte said seriously. "This isn't just about proving yourself. Storm's life depends on this. If you can't make progress—" "I know. I understand." The next morning, James entered the round pen with Storm for the first time. Charlotte, Henry, William, and Samuel all watched from outside the fence, ready to intervene at the first sign of danger. The stallion stood at the far side, his muscles tense, his eyes fixed on the unfamiliar human in his space. James didn't approach. Instead, he simply stood, breathing slowly, letting Storm take him in. Minutes passed. The watching crowd grew restless, but James remained patient. "This is ridiculous," William muttered. "The kid's just standing there." "Shh!" Charlotte silenced him, her eyes never leaving the scene. After what felt like an eternity, James took a single, slow step to the side. Not towards Storm, but parallel to him. Storm's ears flicked, tracking the movement. James took another step, then another, walking in a large circle around the edge of the pen. He wasn't challenging the horse, wasn't demanding anything. He was just existing in the same space. Storm began to move too, maintaining his distance but matching James's pace. They circled the pen together, separate but synchronized, like two dancers learning a new routine. "He's reading the horse's body language," Charlotte whispered in amazement. Look, every time Storm tenses, James stops moving. He's giving him time to process. After 30 minutes, James sat down in the center of the pen, making himself smaller, less threatening. He pulled out an apple from his pocket and took a bite, the crisp sound echoing in the quiet morning air. Then he simply waited, not looking directly at Storm, giving the stallion the choice to approach or not. Storm took 3 steps forward, then 2 more. His nostrils flared, catching the scent of the apple. But more than that, he was drawn by this strange human who didn't demand, didn't force, didn't try to dominate. This human who simply offered presence without pressure. When Storm was 10 feet away, James slowly rolled the remaining piece of apple across the ground. It stopped halfway between them. Storm's eyes tracked the movement, then looked back at James as if asking, "Is this a trick?" James remained perfectly still, his posture relaxed, his breathing even, and Storm, after a long moment of consideration, took those final steps and picked up the apple. Outside the pen, Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes. It was the smallest victory, but it was progress, real, tangible progress. Over the next 2 days, James spent every possible moment with Storm. By the second day, the stallion was taking food directly from James's hand, allowing the boy to stand within arm's reach. By the 3rd morning, James had managed to touch Storm's neck, just briefly, but the horse hadn't shied away. The transformation was remarkable, and word spread quickly through the ranch. Hands who'd been skeptical now gathered to watch the quiet teenager work his magic. But James knew they were running out of time. The BLM representative, a stern woman named Margaret Walsh, was due to arrive that afternoon for her evaluation. "He needs to accept a halter," William told James that morning, his tone serious. "That's the bare minimum Walsh will want to see. Can you do it?" James looked at Storm, who stood nearby, more relaxed than he'd been since his arrival, but still wary. "I can try." That afternoon, with Margaret Walsh watching alongside Henry and Charlotte, James entered the pen with a soft rope halter. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear of Storm, but from fear of failing the magnificent animal who'd begun to trust him. He approached Storm slowly, talking in that soft, steady voice that had become their language. Storm's ears pricked forward, listening. When James raised the halter, showing it to the horse, explaining what he wanted to do, Storm's eyes widened. His nostrils flared. And suddenly, all the progress they'd made seemed to evaporate. Storm backed away, snorting, his head tossing. The memories of ropes and capture and pain flooded back, and his instinct to flee took over. He wheeled and bolted to the far side of the pen, his sides heaving. "That's enough," Margaret Walsh said firmly. "I've seen all I need to see. This horse is too dangerous for adoption. I'll arrange for his transport." "Please," James interrupted, his voice breaking. "Just give me one more chance, tomorrow morning. That's all I'm asking." Margaret shook her head. "Son, I appreciate your effort, but he's not dangerous," James said with surprising force. "He's traumatized. There's a difference. I know you've got procedures, but this horse deserves better than being put down because humans hurt him first." Something in James's words struck a chord. Margaret looked at the boy, really looked at him, and saw the desperation in his eyes. "One more chance," she finally said. "Tomorrow at dawn. But if he shows the same response, I'm making my recommendation." That night, James couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk in the ranch's small bunkhouse, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction with Storm. Around midnight, he gave up on rest and walked out to the pen. Storm was there, standing in the moonlight, and when he heard James approach, he moved toward the fence. James climbed over and sat in the dirt, and to his amazement, Storm came close, near enough that James could feel the warmth of his breath. "I'm sorry," James whispered. "I pushed too fast. I forgot that trust doesn't work on schedules and deadlines. You've taught me so much these past few days, about patience, about listening, about understanding that sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting, it's learning to trust again." James felt hot tears on his cheeks. "I've been angry for so long. Angry at every family that didn't want me, every home that was just temporary. I built walls just like you did, and I'm just starting to realize that maybe those walls don't keep us safe, they just keep us alone." Storm lowered his head, and in a moment that James would remember for the rest of his life, the stallion gently pressed his muzzle against the boy's chest. It was acceptance. It was understanding. It was connection. They sat together in the darkness, boy and horse, two wounded souls who'd found recognition in each other. The sun rose over Riverside Ranch in a spectacular display of pink and gold, painting the Montana landscape in watercolor hues. Margaret Walsh arrived at exactly 6 a.m. as promised, her expression professional but not unkind. Henry, Charlotte, William, and a handful of other ranch hands gathered by the pen, their faces tense with anticipation. James was already there, standing in the center of the pen with Storm. The stallion stood closer than he ever had before, his dark coat gleaming in the early morning light. There was something different in his bearing, still proud, still powerful, but without the desperate edge that had defined him since his arrival. "Whenever you're ready, son," Margaret called out. James took a deep breath. In his hands was the rope halter, but he held it loosely, without urgency. He spoke to Storm in that quiet voice, explaining again what he hoped to do, asking rather than demanding. Storm's ears swiveled, listening to every word. Then James did something that made Charlotte gasp. He draped the halter over Storm's neck and stepped back, giving the horse complete freedom to reject it, to run, to refuse. He was offering a choice, the one thing Storm had been denied when he was first captured. For a long moment, Storm stood perfectly still. Then, in a movement that seemed to defy everything they'd witnessed over the past weeks, the stallion stepped forward. Toward James, toward the halter, toward trust. With hands that shook with emotion rather than fear, James gently guided the halter over Storm's nose and ears, fastening it with the care someone might use handling priceless crystal. Storm tensed briefly, but didn't pull away. He stood, allowing this boy, this human who'd seen his fear and met it with patience, to complete the action that had seemed impossible days before. The silence that followed was profound. Then Charlotte began to clap, and the applause spread through the gathered crowd. James buried his face in Storm's neck, overwhelmed by what they'd accomplished together. Margaret Walsh climbed into the pen, moving slowly, and Storm allowed her to approach, though he kept James between them, still needing that anchor of trust. She examined the fit of the halter, ran a professional eye over the horse's demeanor, and finally nodded. "I'll be recommending Storm for private adoption," she said, her voice thick with emotion she didn't bother to hide. "This is remarkable work, James. Truly remarkable." Henry stepped forward. "Margaret, I'd like to formally adopt Storm for the ranch, and I'd like to offer James a permanent position here as our horse gentler, if he's interested." James looked up, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "You mean—" I mean, you've got a home here if you want it, Henry said gruffly, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Someone with your gift shouldn't be wasted mucking stalls. Well, not exclusively anyway. A smile cracked his weathered face. Charlotte moved forward and pulled James into a hug. You didn't just save Storm, she whispered. You taught all of us something important about patience and understanding, about seeing beyond the surface to what someone really needs. In the weeks that followed, James continued working with Storm, and their bond deepened into something truly extraordinary. The stallion, who'd been deemed untamable, became one of the ranch's most trusted horses, though he remained James's horse first and foremost. They'd ride out together into the Montana wilderness, two once wild spirits who'd found freedom not in isolation, but in connection. James thrived at Riverside Ranch in ways he never had before. He discovered he had a natural gift for working with difficult horses, and word spread. Other ranches began bringing their problem animals to the quiet young man, who understood that broken didn't mean worthless, and that patience could achieve what force never could. On quiet evenings, James would sit with Charlotte and Henry, and they'd talk about the future. James's plans to eventually study equine psychology, maybe start a sanctuary for wild mustangs, dreams that once seemed impossible now felt within reach. But more than any achievement or recognition, what mattered most to James was the simple truth he'd discovered in a round pen with a black stallion, that being seen, being understood, being given the space to heal and trust again, that was the greatest gift one soul could give another. Storm had taught him that, and in teaching it, had given James something he'd searched for his entire life, a place to belong. As the Montana sun set on another day, painting the sky in shades of fire and hope, boy and horse stood together on a ridge overlooking the ranch. Storm's coat gleamed in the golden light, no longer just black, but holding hints of bronze and amber. He was still powerful, still proud, still possessing that wild spirit, but he was no longer alone, neither of them was. And that made all the difference.